Speaker.
Honourable Murray McCully.
Mr Speaker, about 2 weeks ago from today, I received a message at about 5 o'clock in the morning to tell me about the attack by a gunman in the House of Parliament in Canada. And a short time later, I rang our High Commissioner, Simon Tucker, who was in the New Zealand High Commission about 2 blocks from the Canadian Parliament, part of the lockdown that was in place at that time. And when I asked him about the scene there, he said to me, well, just imagine this was happening in the New Zealand Parliament because the layout is about the same. He said it's like someone had taken out a guard at the Supreme Court, just down that way, hijacked a car to the front steps of the Parliament and with a gun burst in the front door. He said that's pretty much the scene that was taking place in Canada that day. And the air of disbelief that was present in Canada on that day was about the same as the air of disbelief you'd expect if that happened in this country. Now, members do not need me to tell them that the threat that we are here to discuss today is a new and very dangerous one for countries like ours, and nor should I need to remind members that the individual responsible for that act in Canada was a person who had been newly radicalised and who had been denied the opportunity to commit jihad in the Middle East and had instead turned his mind to steps of violence that could be undertaken where he was. Mr Speaker, the advent of a well-resourced, globally focused, internet-savvy terrorist group skilled at preying on the vulnerabilities of the disturbed and the disenfranchised is a new and very dangerous phenomenon for countries like ours. And as we have heard today, we now live in a country where there are individuals who have accessed these websites, no doubt many of them disturbed and disenfranchised, who have become radicalised, have planned to go to the Middle East and commit acts of violence there. Some have gone, as the Prime Minister has told us today, some have gone to Syria, but we know that there are others who have been denied the opportunity to go to the Middle East and who remain here, no doubt some of them, like that person in Canada, reflecting on acts of violence that can be undertaken here instead of those that they had intended to undertake in the Middle East. I want to support the words of the Honourable Annette King in relation to the UN Security Council resolution on foreign fighters. I think we should listen. In fact, I attended the beginning of that debate in New York, and I believe that we should listen carefully to what was said there and heed the instructions from the Security Council. And so it is important that New Zealand should play its part, identify the individuals who might export violence from here to places where there's already rather too much of it, prevent them from going, and then turn our minds to how we can make New Zealanders safe in a situation where they will then turn their minds to acts of violence in this country. The reminder we have seen in Canada is one that we should heed in this country, and I accept what Mr David Shearer says to the Parliament, that we shouldn't over-egg the situation. We don't need to try and read more into it than exists, but we do need to understand that there is a challenge here for our society to deal with. We need to be careful that we confront it in a way that doesn't make it worse by making those who are targeted or identified feel more marginalised and therefore more a prospect of being radicalised. I want to commend the balanced way in which most parties have received the address from the Prime Minister today and the way in which other parties have undertaken to consider constructively the recommendations that have been made. There are always challenges trying to find the right balance between the responsibility to respect human rights and civil liberties on one hand and the need to protect the public on the other, and finding that balance can only benefit from the scrutiny of members of the Parliament in Select Committee and on the floor of the House. I want to just pick up the sentiment that's been raised by some members about the need for New Zealand to do more on the humanitarian front. As the Prime Minister has told us today, we've committed about $13.5 million, add to that another $1 million today, to a range of initiatives to try and alleviate the suffering of those who have been displaced and disadvantaged in the Middle East. We've worked with and will continue to work with a range of organisations, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, the Red Cross, the World Food Programme, UN Relief Works Agency, and as well as a range of NGOs. Anyone who's been to any of the refugee camps, as I have, will know the scale of the challenge that confronts people there, and we need to do our part on an ongoing basis. In Turkey, we've taken a rather different approach. We've engaged in bilateral programs with the government of Turkey to construct schools in the refugee camps in that country, and increasingly we need to look for bilateral options to work with countries facing this challenge in the region. I mention in particularly Jordan, the smallest of those countries, with I think 1.5 million refugees now to contend with, a country that is at risk of being truly swamped by the challenge that now confronts them. I heard the words of the leader of the Green Party suggesting that there was no role for military action in relation to Iraq, and I simply say to her, those words will give no comfort to people in towns like Kobani or any of the other towns across Iraq where we've seen cold-blooded killers and people engaged in torture, engaged in the destruction of a very large piece of territory across Iraq and Syria. But once there is a space created through military action, and I believe that the actions that have been undertaken by other countries in that respect do need to be seen in a positive light, given the risk confronting some of the communities there. There will be a need to look at areas for capacity building and support in Iraq in particular. We need to remind ourselves that the seeds of ISIL were sown when we saw the Maliki government in Iraq turn on too many of its own people, showing a lack of respect for their human rights and engaging in acts. Well, there's a long history, as Mr. Goff reminds us there, and I simply say that we need to be ready to do some work in the capacity building area, and I agree with what Mr. Shearer said about the need to look at law and justice agencies and areas of that sort once we do see the opportunity to move beyond the current conflict. Mr. Speaker, I just want to finally recognise the words of those who have referred to New Zealand's role on the UN Security Council from the 1st of July 2015. It isn't until, in January 2015, it's not till January the 1st that we take up the new seat on the UN Security Council. But like others, I was delighted to see 3/4 of the countries in the world support New Zealand for a seat on the Council, but with that support goes a very, very great sense of responsibility. Because if you look at the key conflicts in the Middle East, the UN Security Council has been a bystander for far too many years. If you look at what happened in Syria in recent times, the UN Security Council was a bystander by reason of the veto used by more than one of the permanent members of the Council. As we've seen in relation to the Iran nuclear file, the UN Security Council has very largely been a bystander on that issue, as we've seen the P5+1 process take place outside the UN environment. And of course, in relation to the Middle East peace process as a whole, we've seen a very good resolution passed, I think, some 47 years ago, but no real action to breathe life into that resolution to create a long-standing basis for peace in the Middle East. And so I say to members of the House, taking the longer-term view, New Zealand as a new member of the UN Security Council must commit itself to working with other countries to create a Security Council environment where these challenges are no longer ignored and where the big countries in the world confront their responsibilities.